Happy New Year and welcome to Cedar Lane United Methodist Church. My name's Rick Abbott, and on this Sunday, January 2nd, 2022, the International Sunday School lesson looks at the Genesis account of the world's first murder. Our lesson today is from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. It's the story of Cain and Abel. I'm tempted to say it's the world's oldest cold case, but it's not really a cold case because we know who did it. Still, I do believe there's something to be gained by opening the file and looking at the facts of the case one more time. Before we get started, I need to tell you that we're having an abbreviated Sunday school lesson today to give the choir time to get ready for the second performance of the Christmas cantata. For anyone who might be joining us online, you can see the first performance of that cantata by searching for Cedar Lane Knoxville on YouTube and clicking on the video of One Small Child's Christmas cantata, dated December the 19th, 2021. With that said, let's look at the facts of Abel's murder. I've already said we know who killed him. Cain did it in the field with an unknown weapon. We know that the murder took place in a field located somewhere to the east of the Garden of Eden. After the two brothers were old enough to launch their careers, Cain was a farmer and Abel was a shepherd. We don't know exactly how Abel was killed. All we know is that Cain attacked Abel and killed him. Perhaps he used a stone, perhaps he used a knife, perhaps he used his bare hands. We don't know. But we do have a witness. The witness is Abel himself. After the murder took place, God spoke to Cain and said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 4, the Bible elaborates on that point when it says, "By faith, Abel brought forth to God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he's dead." By faith, Abel's blood cried out to God from the ground for justice. And if I understand the book of Hebrews correctly, he's still crying out for justice today, not only for himself, but for everyone who has had an untimely and violent end at the hands of another human being. You might be surprised to know that at least in some Christian calendars, Abel has a feast day. And by some accounts, it's today, January 2nd. Although some sources use other dates. You know, as an aside, I wish people could standardize things so that the world would work a little better. But I guess the world doesn't really operate that way. The Tower of Babel story addresses that subject, but I guess I'll leave that topic for another day. After all, this is a short lesson. In any event, when I was reading about Abel's feast day, I learned that he's called Abel the Just, to distinguish him from other religious leaders who were named Abel. And that's sort of fitting since our topic this quarter is justice. If Abel still speaks, then I suppose he has a lot to talk about these days. I read that in 2020, the last full year for which we have statistics, The murder rate in the United States went up 30%. That's the highest percentage increase in over 100 years. The average number of murders per 100,000 people is still well below what it was back in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. But murder rates are rising sharply. The only years on record where murder rates went up faster than in 2020 was in 1904 and 1905. And back then, better reporting was probably the reason for the increase rather than the actual increase in homicides. Although we don't have any final statistics for 2021 yet, the trend toward rising murders appears to be continuing, with about 2/3 of the most populous cities having recorded an increase in murders compared to 2020. The other thing I learned was that, like the case of Cain and Abel, more than half of all recorded murders involve people who know each other, at least in the cases where the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim is known. And like Cain, a substantial majority of the people who committed murders were men, 89%. And like Abel, most of the murder victims were also men, 78%. And about a quarter of all victims were killed by family members. And that brings us to the most difficult part of the Cain and Abel case, the question of motive. In a way, motive seems obvious. Cain was jealous of Abel. But we need to ask ourselves, how did Cain and Abel's relationship get to that point? How could one brother become so jealous of another that he would kill his only sibling in cold blood in a premeditated murder? Now, I'm an only child, so I don't really know much about sibling rivalry. But the Bible does tell us something about the relationship of the two brothers. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 3-7, the Bible says this: "In the course of time, Cain brought forth of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but not on Cain and his offering. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, and you must rule over it.' The anger and jealousy that Cain felt toward Abel had spiritual roots. It had to do with Cain and Abel's relationship with God rather than their relationship with their parents or anyone else. In fact, it looks like Cain might have been his mother's favorite. When Cain was born, his mother said, 'With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man.' But when Abel was born, she didn't say anything. Cain's name means acquired or possessed. Basically, Eve said she had acquired a man. She was proud to have a son. On the other hand, Abel's name means breath, vapor, vanity, or spirit. It is generally thought that Abel's name foreshadowed his fate. He died young, so his life was like a vapor. This story is not like the story of Joseph, where his brothers sold him into slavery because he was his father's favorite. In this case, Cain was the favorite. Cain, the murderer, was the favorite. The Bible tells us that Cain was jealous of Abel's relationship with God. God looked with favor on Abel's offering, but he did not look with favor on Cain's offering. There may be several reasons for this. First, Cain was a tiller of the field. Agriculture is the foundation of cities and civilization. It is no accident that Cain is also the builder of the first city. On the other hand, Abel kept flocks. He was a shepherd, like many Israelites before him, including King David. Wait a minute. I said before him. After him. Shepherds were thought to be less earthly minded. They were not building cities, roads, and irrigation systems. They were living in the fields in nature with God. Perhaps a more important reason why God favored Abel was that Abel was more committed to God than Cain was. The Bible says that Cain brought to God some of the fruits of the soil, but Abel brought some of the firstborn of his flock. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock. He gave God the first share of all he had. He made God the top priority. Cain didn't do that. He brought to God some of his harvest, but he kept the first portions for himself. Cain was an acquirer. That's what his name meant. And as an acquirer, he kept the most valuable possessions for himself. In short, Abel trusted God with the best he had, and Cain didn't. The last and most important reason that God favored Abel over Cain was that Abel made his offerings to God in faith. Remember that in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, the Bible says, by faith, Abel brought forth to God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteousness when God spoke well of his offerings. Now that we've reviewed the case, what have we learned? Well, we already knew most of the basics about who, where, and what. Cain did it in a field. We don't know the weapon. By faith, Abel was a witness before God, even though he was dead. All of this you probably already knew. But if you're like me, you may not have given much thought to the motive. Yes, it's obvious that Cain was jealous and angry, but why did he feel that way? Cain's anger, like most anger, has spiritual origins. He was earthly minded, focusing on acquiring crops and cities instead of serving God. He was not willing to offer God his first fruits, and he did not trust God the way Abel did. Don't these same motives lead to a lot of anger and violence today? Isn't that why Abel's blood still cries out for justice? We live in a time of anger and division. Perhaps we can still learn from the story of Cain and Abel. Perhaps Abel's blood still speaks.